listening to The Trident, a podcast on irregular warfare and related issues in the international security environment. The Trident is sponsored by the U.S. Naval War College's Center on Irregular Warfare and Armed Groups. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, retired Army Colonel Dave Brown, and Director of the Center on Irregular Warfare here at the college. Welcome to the Trident. For this special episode and on the occasion of its 140th anniversary, we take a break today from the annals of irregular warfare to focus on the historical legacy and the significance of the United States Naval War College, the oldest continuing institution of its kind in the world. I'm joined today by Dr. John Hattendorf. John is now Professor Emeritus of the college. He was the Ernest J. King Professor of Maritime History, a chair he occupied at the U.S. Naval War College from 1984 to 2016. He also served as chairman of the college's Advanced Research Department from 1986 to 2003, and was chairman of the Maritime History Department and director of the Naval War College Museum from 2003 to 2016. John is a former surface warfare officer, earned degrees in history from Kenyon College, Brown University, and the University of Oxford. He's the author or editor of more than 50 books, including Sailors and Scholars and the Oxford Encyclopedia of Maritime History. We're also joined today by Dr. John Maurer, who is the Alfred Thayer Mahan Distinguished University Professor of Sea Power and Grand Strategy here at the college, and he's the former chair of the Strategy and Policy Department. A graduate of Yale, John also holds a PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, and is the author or editor of books examining the outbreak of the First World War, naval rivalry and arms control between the two world wars, and a study about Winston Churchill's views on British foreign policy and grand strategy, among other topics. He is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, FPRI, and has served as the executive editor of Orbis, a journal of world affairs. He also serves on the academic board of advisors for the International Churchill Society and has served on the Secretary of the Navy's Advisory Committee on Naval History. Welcome to you both. We've entitled today's episode, Viribus Mari Victoria, the U.S. Naval War College, 140 Years of Excellence. Viribus Mari Victoria, or from the Latin, victory through sea power, is the motto of the college. And as we are about to celebrate the 140th year of this crown jewel and national treasure that is the U.S. Naval War College, it's a privilege to have both of you here as esteemed colleagues and historians to discuss the college's legacy and significance. Now, John, you, along with a couple of other colleagues, literally wrote the book on this topic, Sailors and Scholars, which I have a copy here in front of me, which was the centennial history of the Naval War College, so published in 1984, exactly 100 years from the founding of the college on the 6th of October in 1884. And I was struck by your opening description of the U.S. Navy's size and composition in the era immediately following the American Civil War. Maybe you could comment on that for a minute.
Well, it was not one of the top navies, certainly. I think various people have rated it, but it's way down in the at least 15th or 20th Navy in the world. Very outmoded vessels. It had been a leading innovator during in the American Civil War, but that suddenly was shut down and no innovation going on. So the flagships were wooden ships, many of them. Although we had some of the steel ships that had been built in the 1880s were still there.
And I think you mentioned in the book that the USS Tennessee was like the one first-rate ship, which was a wooden war vessel, and this was the entire structure of first-class vessel in terms of what the U.S. Navy
That's right,
had.
and that was she was the flagship of the North Atlantic Squadron, which was the predecessor of the Atlantic Fleet, and was the flagship of Admiral Luce when he was commander and sort of senior officer at sea.
And this was really the beginnings of the era when the U.S. Naval War College was being envisioned and came to birth. And I do have to mention one other thing. We'll talk about Admiral Luce here in a minute. But of course, as many of you know, if you listen to our podcast, I'm a retired Army officer, retired Army artillery officer, and there's a very unique connection between Army leadership and Admiral Luce. And in fact, the birth of the idea of the American U.S. Naval War College came from his engagement first with General Sherman and then General Upton. Maybe we could talk about that for a minute. John, are you familiar with the piece on General Sherman and his connection with Admiral Luce?
Well, just to follow up on what John Handorf was saying, this period is referred to as the Dark Ages of the U.S. Navy for good reason. But Luce served in the American Civil War, as did Alfred Thayer Mahan. And this was a formative experience in their lives. And Luce was impressed by Sherman's grasp of operations and strategy. Luce served with Sherman, and Sherman predicted the fall of Charleston almost to the day.
So Luce was actually, I think, on the Pontiac. Like he was on the blockade duty. They'd been blockading Charleston Harbor. The U.S. Navy had been blockading it for years, I believe.
Throughout the war. Yes, yes. And Sherman's march through Georgia and then through the Carolinas, Luce was impressed by how Sherman could look and predict the future, how operations were going to unfold, and when Charleston would fall to the Union. And so this so impressed Luce that he realized that there was a need for understanding strategy and operations, that naval officers had to be educated to understand these higher levels of warfare.
Essentially, I think the quotation was that Sherman had told him, even though you've been blockading the city for some time, I'm going to cut it off from the land, and we will watch Charleston fall like a ripe pear. And Luce was amazed when this came to pass. And I quote him, he said that the scales seemed to fall away from my eyes, and it dawned on me that there was, as you said, John, these fundamental principles underlying military operations that would apply to operations that were conducted on land or sea. And we ought to be thinking and studying about those.
Luce repeatedly made that connection and told that story during his lifetime.
And what about a connection to General Upton? General Upton, I believe, was the head of the artillery school in Virginia. And Luce was very taken with the professional military education that the Army was conducting and was using the artillery school as a model to think about establishing a similar type of school for the Navy as well.
Navy. And at the time, Luce was the commanding officer of the USS Hartford, what had been Farragut's flagship at the Battle of Mobile Bay, and but based in Norfolk, Virginia. And he got to know Emory Upton quite well. And they would have very important talks that really helped develop Luce's ideas. And so this is one of Luce came up with an idea, what he called the comparative method, which is what he brought into the War College, looking at military operations, military theory, and trying to see what of that would apply to navies. And at that point in time, there was no abstract thinking about naval warfare. It was all tactical history. All the histories, all the studies were done at sort of the tactical level and none at the higher level. So this is what got him going. And he had there's only one or two surviving letters between Upton and Luce. which somehow completely were missed by the editor of Epton's correspondence, but I've got them in Luce's correspondence.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I must pull on that thread a little bit, because now you have an Army officer, interviewing these two naval historians. But there's a third Army officer here that had a great influence very early on, and that's Tasker Bliss. And Tasker Bliss was a young Army officer, had taught at West Point, also an artillery officer. He later became the Chief of Staff of the United States Army in the First World War. But at this time, he was coming here to lecture, and I believe that he and Luce were the only two professors here at the opening of the college in the very, very early years.
That's correct, and Bliss was a second lieutenant at this time in 1885 at the first class, but his job was to do this comparative, bring Army thinking in and see what we could do, and later on Mahan was to take the other side of that and be the complement to that. But the other really important thing is that Bliss goes on 20 years later, or almost 20 years later, to become the first president of the Army War College when it was established.
That's true.
So there's a direct connection between the Naval War College and the Army War College.
Well, let's talk about that first decade a little bit. So humble beginnings. The college begins in 1884, and then that first decade, those main figures, certainly Luce and Mahan, as John has indicated, but there's a fight over what should be being studied. I think there's an intent in some ways to say this should just be a secondary course at Annapolis for technological things of the day, steamships, warships, that sort of thing. What was the argument that Luce was really making about the study of war, and why that became such an important fight and a core competency of the college?
Luce believed that it was pretty clear how an officer in the Navy went from ensign to captain, and how you prepared yourself to become a flag officer or an advisor to a flag officer. This sort of thing was totally missing in the Navy in this period. So he saw that as the purpose of the college, to look at that, to look at the highest aspects of the naval profession. And there was no place really in the world that was doing that. So it was really his ideas, his discussions with Upton, and his experience with General Sherman in the war that brought him to that idea. But he ran into this, what is a consistent criticism of the college, and that's the debate between technical education and the broader education, which rounds around history and political science, economics, international law, which is what Luce saw was missing in the education, and what other people felt was important was, we've seen this. It continues today, actually. So, most famously, during my time in the college, was Admiral Rickover's trying to close down the college, and would call up the president of the War College and say, "What a useless place! We need to read more, nuclear physics. We don't need this history stuff." And that was exactly what was going on. Except in those days, in the 1880s, the main weapon was the torpedo, and the torpedo station, which was here in Newport.
It's here in the bay. Right?
In the bay here on the next island to the south of us, on Goat Island in those days, now a hotel and a closed community. But in those days, the critics wanted people to go there for technical training. They didn't really and this another continuing issue. They didn't really understand what the difference between education and training, and so this is an issue that we still have today at the college.
Yeah, I think they fought quite a bit over combining those commands and not in having the War College independent. But this dialogue, as you said, about just technocratic understanding of the science of war, which is not unimportant. It is important. But I think that Luce was looking for that higher level education about all aspects of war, and that the officers should be educated for high command only if they would understand international relations and economics and those larger questions of war. And that's, I think, what had impressed him so much about Sherman. It wasn't just about some technical feat. It was about understanding the larger operational structures of those campaigns.
Strategy and operations, one way of approaching that topic of studying it and preparing people for leadership, is to try to draw, as Luce did and Mahan did, try to draw certain principles of war. And where do you draw those principles of war from? Well, typically it is study history. In history, because that's the real world. That's what actually happened. And to look at commanders of the past, why they were successful or failed. To draw away what we might call best practices of what leads to success in war. Now, there's a tension there, though, because studying history, well, it looks backwards, whereas leaders have to look forward. And of course, in the modern age, an age of industry and technology, where technology is constantly changing, it seems to be that, well, this technology invalidates whatever history has to show, that the world is created anew by this new technology. And so the lessons of the past don't have much value. And so there's constantly this tension that we've talked about, that technology is such a main driver of events that an education that uses history to draw away lessons or principles, takeaways, best practices, doesn't seem to amount to much. We're all familiar with the famous quip from Henry Ford that history is bunk. To be a successful leader of the future, you have to grasp the new ideas, the new technologies. And Mahan understood this. And in fact, he said that technology is constantly changing. And as a consequence of that, tactics have to always be changing in relation to the technology of the time. But he then said that strategy was built like on a rock. It's foundational and it's enduring. And so he had to address that question of what is the relationship of technology to the study of strategy. And he wanted to highlight that, as you said, Dave, that the technology does change things dramatically at the tactical level, and that then has strategic effects. But at the same time, a seasoned leader should be looking to the past to try to understand strategic principles to guide operations.
So that argument has been with us for 140 years.
It's a factor of living in an industrial technological age, and it's something that clearly has to be addressed for anybody who is going to be a strategic thinker, planner of the future, has to grasp not only these principles that are enduring, but also understand how technology is changing tactics and operations
as
as
a
well.
slight aside there, obviously Clausewitz makes a very distinction between the unchanging nature of war,
Yes.
violent, political, fog, friction, and the changing character, which can be technological, can be contextual in terms of geographical positions and this sort of thing. But we make that distinction for our students today. I do want to pull on a little bit about the beginning, the opening volleys of scholarship here, because both of you are scholars and have published extensively. And at the very beginnings of the college was in a way saved by scholarship and John Maurer, Dr. Maurer, I've heard you tell the story to some of our students in the past about the Secretary of the Navy and the influence that a book and scholarship had on the maintaining of and the survival of the college itself.
Well, as John said, there have been repeated attempts to close down the college, not understanding how it does contribute to naval effectiveness. And one of those turning points was after Luce left the college and Mahan left the college, an attempt to close it down. And Hillary Herbert, who was Secretary of the Navy, was coming up to Newport. And the story goes that he was going to close down the college. but while leaving Washington for Newport, he was handed one of Mahan's books on the influence of sea power. And he read it, and supposedly the scales fell from his eyes. And when he came to Newport, he said, I intended to close the college, but now I'll do everything in my power to keep it alive. That this book alone is worth all the money that has been spent on the college. Well, Mahan at this point was a celebrity. He was in charge of the captain of the cruiser Chicago, which was then in Europe. And he was being feted by everyone, meeting Queen Victoria, Kaiser Wilhelm. His books were an international success. Clearly, Mahan was in tune with the temper of the times. And he was a international celebrity. And so, not surprisingly, Hillary Herbert looks at this and says, there has to be something here. And of course, Mahan's message is the importance of naval preparedness and how countries that aspire to be world powers have to have great navies. And the United States at this time was becoming a great power. Around this same time that Mahan is publishing his Influence of Sea Power books, the United States is emerging as an industrial power stronger than Britain. The Great Columbian Exhibition of 1893 in Chicago highlighted American technology, industry, and agriculture. So this is a time in which Americans are conscious that the United States is emerging as an industrial leader, and also other powers are as well. So Mahan's book very much fits the temper of the time, that there's a rising great power competition that's coming about, and navies are going to be an important part of that competition.
And that book, this first book, was based on lectures that he originally gave here at the college on the influence of history, or the influence of naval power on.
That's right. And both his first two books on the influence of sea power on the French Revolution Empire were also lectures here. But I wanted to mention that Mahan gets a lot of the credit from historians because he's a historian. But there were two other important innovations that were going on at the college at the same time, which showed its connection to new thinking. One was international law. So you had Charles Stockton, who was here as a commander. He was just between when Mahan's presidencies, two presidencies, Stockton sort of held down the college and administered.
This is where we named the Stockton Law Center from, right?
And so he was at this time only a commander, but he eventually becomes rear admiral. But he's a pioneer in understanding international law and writes the first attempt to make an international law for naval affairs, similar to what the Army had during the Civil War. And the other area of importance is war gaming. So William McCarty Little here was a lieutenant who was invalided out of service and volunteered from 1885 to work alongside Admiral Lewson to help him here, and he studies wargaming, what's going on in the German army, and begins to, for the first time, really, in America, to apply it to American naval thinking. And so in 1886, he gives the first lectures here, and then it develops into a major way of taking these historical ideas and putting them down, trying to war game them out and apply them in modern cases. And an interesting connection between Mahan and wargaming is that McCarty Little war games a number of the battles that are in his books and actually draws the diagram in Mahan's books and draws the diagrams for his books.
And obviously that becomes a major feature of the influence of the Naval War College as well. And we'll come to that a little bit. I want to go back a minute too about the influence. So we've talked about Stockton, Lewis, Mahan, and there's also outside influencers. And at the turn there where naval matters were becoming so prominent that John Maurer just mentioned, there were also other figures, and I think of Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt obviously so he does his first public policy speech here as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. But before that, when he was a younger man, he had written another piece of scholarship that's still thought of well on the War of 1812, and he was invited here to lecture before he really became famous, and later on pushed this whole notion of naval power in the United States. And did he lecture for long, or was that just a short event?
Well, he came in 86, I think it was, that Admiral Luce, just as Luce was leaving the position, Luce has read his book on the War of 1812. And he writes to Roosevelt. He had known Theodore Roosevelt's father, who was on the Board of Education in New York when Luce was establishing the New York State Maritime School at Fort Schuyler, now at Fort Schuyler, and then helped to arrange to get a Navy ship up there to be helping for merchant marine training. And this was originally done in connection with the New York Education Department. And that's how we knew the father. And had actually, I think, met the son as a younger man. And so he had a connection and wrote to him. And when the younger TR was left Harvard, and where he'd done this study, and said, "Well, this book should be in our curriculum, and I want you to meet my young successor, Alfred Mahan." And of course, they later become close correspondents and trade ideas even when he's president. So it's a great...
Not knowing that he'd become president of the United States, obviously, but again, early on in the history of the college, you have these figures that are influential in world affairs in a great deal. You also mentioned, the Germans and, the Brits obviously were the big naval power, example. And yet out of the Prussian wars, the Prussian army became extraordinarily famous for its ideas about war colleges and about education, professional education. Was there some attempt to kind of look at the school in Berlin and make it, or to kind of model some aspects of thinking about how to create professional war colleges out of that model?
Certainly there was, and it was a major influence. But there was also a naval component of this. There was the Imperial German Navy had a similar school in Kiel, which is really the first of this. We often claim that we're the first, but that was probably the first. But it went out of business, so they're not still saying that they're still alive. But in about 1911, we started a system called the applicatory system here, and it eventually evolves into what's called by the 1940s the Sound Military Decision under Alfred Kalfas, which was the leading book that the college taught, the methods that it taught. Estimate of the situation, all these ideas that came from the German thinking that were brought into naval thinking and formed the ways that the Navy operated in the Second World War. And so some people took exception to that, and we'll get into that. But that was the main education that people had here in the interwar years.
It should be remembered that when we're going through our Civil War, and Dave, you mentioned this, that Germany is also being unified as a country. And in 1870-71, Prussia-Germany beats France in the Franco-German War. And that was considered quite an upset. And so around the world, those who are interested in military affairs, militaries, navies, are looking to say, why is it that Germany defeated France? Because France had that aura of Napoleon. And in fact, when the war began, there was a Napoleon on the throne as Emperor of France. That Germany won so quickly over a Napoleonic France that the world looked and said, we're stunned by that. Why did that happen? And they looked and they said, well, there's superior generalship and leadership. Helmut von Moltke, who is chief
Superior
of the,
education.
well, and it's rooted in
Right.
education.
Right.
That Moltke and the general staff officers around him had been very well educated in operations and strategy at war colleges, and so this then became a model that around the world militaries wanted to emulate. That there needed to be a general staff officers, again, as John said, to educate officers for higher leadership, or to be the staff officers advising the higher leaders. And to do that, though, to have well-educated leaders, you had to have a college, a war college, to go along with it. So you see here the creation of a professional school. And at the same time, you see professions in business and also in medicine and in law taking place as well. So this is part of a larger cultural phenomenon that says that you have to have higher education for those in these serious professions.
What about the, let's jump ahead a little bit to, there's a battleship conference here in 1908. I think President Roosevelt comes. And I know that John Maurer's done some work on later on in the arms control on the naval side as well. But what's the significance of, again, looking at the War College's influence either on the General Board or on battleship conferences, things that are really monumental in the movement of these issues?
It's very important to the Battleship Conference. Is the first time we had a president of the United States come to the Naval War College. So that's a major event. But the significance of it really in history is that Roosevelt had just sent the Great White Fleet around the world. Mm-hmm. And at the same time they're going around the world, Roosevelt is aware that the American naval battleship fleet is way behind in terms of its design. The British have launched HMS Dreadnought, other things going on in the world, and they were put everything out of way behind in terms of design. And there has been a debate about what battleships should carry, many guns or just heavy guns or this kind of thing, and whether they should be fast or this kind of thing, with the debates that were going on. So he convened this conference here to try to get some good ideas going for battleship design and concepts for battleships design. And he personally chaired the first day of it, and then it went on for the whole, most of the summer. And his aide, Admiral William S. Sims, well then Lieutenant Commander William S. Sims, came up here and observed the whole thing and took notes on it. Curiously, he had a room at the Newport Reading Room, a men's club in town in those days, and if you go to see his papers in the Library of Congress,
Sims,
mm-hmm. and you'll see that Sims, they're all on letterhead from the Newport Reading Room, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. all typed out. But it took the bureaus were in charge of, the different bureaus that the Navy had were in charge of warship construction, and there was great disagreement among the bureaus how to do this. So it took a long time to get the new design going, but it eventually did. But it was part of this development of how to design a warship.
John?
And this is part of the theme that we were talking about earlier, which is technology being a driver of the type of weapons that you're going to develop. And as John mentioned, this is a time of rapid technological change. And the Great White Fleet that Theodore Roosevelt sent around the world was obsolescent. It was being made an inferior force by the changes in technology and the British launching of the Dreadnought and the Germans building an equivalent as well, so that the American battle fleet that had been invested in now was not competitive with this new generation of warships. And so Roosevelt, very much attuned to naval affairs, And we've talked about him writing on naval history, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and also his understanding of world politics meant that the United States had to have a competitive Navy in this era of great power competition, that it was essential that the president take a look at this, that the president get involved with looking at the design of the latest generation of warships, again, to keep the United States competitive with other great powers, and in this case, Britain and Germany in particular, and also fears of a rising power in the Pacific, Japan.
Let's move forward a little bit in time here to Sims' era, that he comes back later. I guess we're really talking about the era of the First World War, what Sims has done. But in the book that you've written about the history of the college, when he gets here, I think he's one of the first reformers and innovators that really looks to envision both a broader course for education here at the college, but he's also trying to influence the reorganization of the entire Navy with a platform here in Newport.
Right, and he's a product of the War College, and he went through the first iteration. The courses were only summer courses,
right?
Sometimes only a month, and sometimes they expanded out to 3 months. But it wasn't until after World War I that it becomes a full year course for everybody. But in 1912, Sims becomes part of the first long course here. So he gets, it was a 2-year course at that point, and they were even thinking about a 3rd year to do this. And he comes out of this, he's only a captain at this point, but he comes out of this with a devotion to what the college was promoting, which was the development of staff work. The college is has been arguing for years that the Secretary of the Navy, who's the civilian leader, needs to have a senior uniform advisor. And so we're actually promoting the concept of the Chief of Naval Operations, which becomes the Chief of Naval Operations, which isn't come into effect until 1915. And there's an earlier attempt to do this with the aid for operations, but that's not as successful as the other idea. But in his preparation, he leaves here after his long course and becomes head of the destroyer squadron, and he takes with it and really puts the first afloat staff at work, where he gets a staff of his destroyers, and they were actually doing tabletop war games out in their destroyers. And then he takes this concept to London when he's made Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. operating fleet in Europe, operating forces in Europe during World War I. And he rises to a 2-star and then to a 3-star and 4-star in that short period. And he creates the first major commander's staff that the U.S. Navy has in London, and doing exactly the kinds of things that the War College was teaching at that time, developing that, and then trying to influence how the Navy operates.
Now, is it true that after the war, he's offered some very high positions in Washington, and he basically turns them down in order to become president of the War College because he feels it's a place of influence?
He's a very he's a controversial character, and he's very critical of the Chief of Naval Operations. So if he had gotten a CNO job, which he was really in line for, he would have been immediately in the middle of a fight. But he felt he could do that better here in Newport as president of the War College. So it's one of those interesting cases, which was typical of that time, when he arrives here in 1919 as a 4-star. There's a big parade in Newport as a 4-star, and the next day he goes to work at the War College as a 2-star.
Wow. But one of the more influential figures, I think, in the history of the college. I mean, certainly
in the history of the Navy too.
In the history of the Navy, far-reaching, far-looking, visionary in some ways. Also, there was I didn't realize this. Is this something connected to the college? A U-boat shows up here in Newport Harbor in 1916. And also, I read snippets in the book that we start to see very famous people become famous in the Second World War particularly, but Stark and Nimitz are students in the 20s.
22 and 23.
Yeah.
And so they are writing papers. I think Stark, who's famous for some of his analysis later on, but he's put together a list of readings that all the other students at the War College should do professionalization in terms of their own reading list and thinking about what to take with them or to read. And Nimitz is writing theses on various aspects of naval warfare. And
well, these are all part of the curriculum that was at the time. Stark's work is really making the cliff notes to the assigned readings.
Right.
So he's sort of helping the other guys through the course and not doing what the faculty wanted him to do, which was to read the whole book. But he's doing a précis of these things, which is interesting. And that was a very interesting. That was the last year of Sims's presidency, 1922-23. Sims retires in the midst of that year in October of 22, and but it had a. Commander Chester Nimitz is in the class, and Harold Stark's in the class, and a number of other later senior officers are in the class. So it's a very interesting shift from the First World War to the Second World War.
Well, let's talk about the intervening years there between the wars as well, because you've already mentioned war games, but in those interwar years, there are a number of war games that are being, if not popularized, used by the Navy or thinking, and become kind of the colored war plans, famously War Plan Orange against the Japanese. And also you have other things. We have, Halsey, King, Spruance, other people being educated here as students that go on to great rank. And you also have Pratt working on logistics as a feature of the curriculum that is really kind of a new emphasis on major war theater level, expeditionary war at scale. And I was surprised, again, once I found another Army figure in here, that the first few people in the logistics course, none of them were Navy, but one of them was Army Colonel, Colonel Walter Reed, that of course we've named the medical center after famously. Let's talk about those wars, or those interwar years, and how important they were to the development of the Navy and also things that are going on here at the college.
Well, I think in some ways this period has been overcharacterized as just wargaming, and so much emphasis has been put on wargaming. They were really doing other things in the course. They were reading books. They were looking at the theorists. They were writing papers, as you mentioned. They had a strategy paper. Students had a strategy paper to write and a tactics paper, and I think one other to do during the year. So they were doing what we've always done here, but the urban myth is that they were just doing wargaming, and there's sometimes a tendency to say, well, we should just go back and do just wargaming, but that's overemphasizing it. So you did have this overall.
And when you look at the papers that are written by the students there and the bibliographies that they have, you see what they were reading at the time. And some of the things that they were reading are things that we still read today, like Mahan's Influence of Sea Power Upon History. You'll find Clausewitz was being read. Also Sir Julian Corbett was being read for strategy papers. There was also, given the time in the period after the First World War, looking at high command. So there would be studies of the great French war leader, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who was in charge of the Allied armies in the closing stages of the First World War. So looking at high command as well, at a recent leader who had led a coalition of armies to defeat Germany. So, as John said, there's much more to the War College education than wargaming. It's important to note, too, that there are some failings of the interwar period. And again, it's due to the larger blinders of American society and politics of the time. But they had just come out of the First World War, where a large expeditionary force had been sent over to France, over 2 million American soldiers in France at the time of the armistice. Well, it was thought that that would never happen again. And so studies of the first Battle of the Atlantic, how the British and American navies had defeated the German U-boats in the First World War, didn't get nearly as much attention as it should have received. Admiral Richardson, who was in command of the Pacific Fleet before Pearl Harbor, before Kimmel, he later wrote that we didn't give nearly as much attention to what it would take to transport another American expeditionary force to Europe, because we would never do that again. Again, the blinders of an isolationist America that thought another war in Europe was something the U.S. wouldn't be involved in. Also, when you look at some of the war games that were fought, we highlight war games of operations, tactics against Japan. But there were also a number of war games that were fought out against Great Britain. One of the war plans that we had was the Red War Plan, which was for a war between the United States and Britain. And those battles, war games that would fought out, often culminated in the Battle of Sable Island off the coast of Canada, in which the U.S. and British battle fleets would fight each other in those engagements. Well, of course, that war never took place between Britain and the United States. And today we look back and we laugh at that. But at the same time, those imaginary battles were still useful for shaping the minds of future leaders in operations and leaders of fleets about how to operate their forces. So even battles against the Royal Navy, battles that never occurred, nonetheless were useful for shaping future leaders and their ability to lead fleets in action.
And there's also a way of looking at how to build the American fleet to be a competitor to the British
Yes.
takeover from that side. We were also rethinking and fighting the Battle of Jutland with modern and future forces.
On the wargaming floor.
On the wargaming floor here.
So very famous pictures of the wargaming floor.
So all these things were adding together.
But, John, back to your point about wargaming, I mean, there's some myths about, Warplane Orange, for instance. And I think famously, maybe it was Nimitz that I think addressing a War College audience after the war said, there was nothing that we didn't envision because we had done all these war games. That's not entirely true. It didn't envision the Army doing all the amphibious landings. It didn't envision kamikazes, didn't envision nuclear weapons. Yet, iterative wargaming at scale and looking at that over and over and over did help prepare those senior leaders for major operations in the Pacific and elsewhere, and became a true feature of work that's done here at the college and still goes on in a storied wargaming department here at the college as well.
Right, and one of the interesting things of Nimitz, I mean, some of that was done as a way to sort of advertise the college when it was having trouble, and he came back as the president of the college invites him back to say something good about his time here. But he was very honest about it, and because it did have a major influence in Nimitz's thinking. And if you look at what's now known as Nimitz's Gray Book, which was his daily report about what how he dealt with the war in the Pacific. That's a playbook that was directly the way it was being taught here at the Naval War College, in how to do staff work, how to approach this sort of thing, and it's in what we were teaching there and what he was carrying out.
What happens during the war, in the Second World War? Does the college shut down? Does it stay in operation? So there was an attempt to, or thought about shutting it down, and then I think it sort of kind of creeps through.
Well, it had been closed in the Spanish-American War, and it closed in the First World War. But Admiral Kalfas, who was then the president of the college, wanted to be sure that it stayed open. It still had he thought a great function to do. Of course, this is an exercise that we're involved in today, is to think about a future situation. If we were at war, what kind of work?
What would the role of the college be?
Right. So we're beginning to look at a number of people at the college are looking at this issue. But we had a course continuing. We also had the development of the Armed Forces Staff College, which is now the college in Norfolk, but then it hadn't been established yet there, and it was the naval part of that was taught here in Newport. And the students would come and be on the.
Well, in fact, there was a joint course here, right? The Army Navy Staff College was combined here,
about,
right?
Yeah.
And so.
And the top level of Luce Hall were the classrooms for that.
So really, in some ways, kind of one of the first efforts to do joint education, even though it wasn't codified in law at the time, but the Army Navy Staff College was done here so that they could use other places, and there was a combined class. I was struck by one passage in the book that, talked about the importance of other services officers here, and at that time period, I think the Army, looking at the war, it said, well, I'm going to withdraw all the students. And the president basically went down to Washington or whatever and said, don't want to do that, and they actually ended up leaving the Army students here. But there was a statement about those students that they brought a tremendous amount of depth and their own experience and their own military education experience to the classroom, and they wanted them here. And I think that still continues today as a joint contribution to student and faculty.
Sure, and I mean now by congressional fiat we are a joint college.
Right.
But even before this, we had the first commandant of the Coast Guard. We had all these Marines. We had other Army officers here and Air Force officers eventually coming in. So it's always been kind of a joint, bringing the other forces together to see how they think and improve the Navy, the Navy's way of approach.
And one of you talked to me about the pie board here for a minute. As I read about that, it seemed like it was one of those touchstones where it was trying to influence the services that we must continue to educate throughout a career for professional officers. You can't just have some education at the beginning. You have to basically produce professional military education throughout an officer's career, and why it's so important. Is that a...
Yeah, well, this is a later edition, a later iteration of what had started. I mean, from the very beginning, Luce was suggesting this. Right. And then it becomes famous in the Knox King Pie Board that meets here in around the time of the First World War. And then, of course, King becomes Chief of Naval Operations, and Pye is out in the Pacific, and then comes back to be president of the Naval War College during the war. And he's asked to do this, so it's a later iteration of that idea, which is really planning future, what an officer's career should look like. This was part of a fairly new idea that people were thinking about.
And let's continue pulling that historical thread forward after the war. There is a great emphasis on logistics, on books, on analyzing battles, professionalizing planning guides. So I'm thinking of Eccles being here, his emphasis on what the lessons were with large-scale logistics, but also his developing the library and adding to volumes that students could draw from while they were here in the professional education. Bates and the whole thing about should we look back at these battles and try to determine things that we should have learned from an educational standpoint. And of course, Spruance. We should talk about Spruance. Famously comes back here as a president and really tries to professionalize in the process, the staff work, the things that we should be doing as a matter of course. All those things are occurring after the war here at the college.
After the war, and it's partly because these are the officers who had been educated here in the interwar period, and they were basically dissatisfied with what their education had been. The experience of the war had shown that there were great gaps in the kind of knowledge that they needed to do. They were not prepared to be to manage an occupation force, for example, and they had not idea how to do these things. The Navy was given, administrative control of the islands in the Pacific. They had no preparation for even thinking about that during the war or in the interwar years. So Spruance was here. He took exception with the sound military decision approach to thinking about operations, and he came up with a much slimmer operations manual to
more usable. Right.
And it didn't get off into these more arcane arguments, he thought. Then he brought Admiral Bates, or then Commodore Bates, here to look at more recent warfare and to analyze the actions of the Second World War and what could be learned from them. He brought Captain Henry Eccles here, later Rear Admiral, to be to have a logistics department and to think about that. And that's when the college acquired Sims Hall for that purpose. And the wargaming floor that there was the logistics war game that survives today. And so he made the first discussions and investigations into the possibility of future nuclear war. So there were lots of innovations and new thinking that was going on under the Spruance years.
When you think of it, I mean, this is a period of incredible change in the international system, but also in technology. And the United States has now emerged as the leading world power in the aftermath of the Second World War. You have a Cold War.
The greatest Navy in the world.
It is the greatest Navy in the world. It supplanted Britain by several measures. And a Cold War is emerging with the Soviet Union. And as John just mentioned, you have this incredible new powerful technology in nuclear weaponry. And who's going to be in charge of that? And you have now the National Security Act bringing into place a new service, an Air Force, one of whose primary roles is the delivery of nuclear weapons. So the question then becomes, what is the role of a Navy in a world in which the real strike arm is Strategic Air Command and under the Air Force? So the older services, Army and Navy, have to think about what is their role in an age of nuclear weaponry. So this is a major change that's taking place, and there's a big fight over whether new big carriers should be built at this time. What is the role of aircraft carriers? And then, of course, in 1950, we have the onset of the Korean War, which shows the value of aircraft being launched from carriers as part of a regional war. So this is an incredible era of change in the international system, in technology, and America's role in the world, and the danger of a larger war with the Soviet Union. So the War College has to adapt to this new time.
It seems like Sims, Spruance is a major figure here, in terms of some of these reforms, bringing in people that are doing these particular tasks, massive influence, again, from the college outside the walls here to the larger world. A couple of other things that happened during this time period, I should, side notes. The two of you are sitting here. Spruance had a hand in bringing in civilian faculty. I mean, it was military faculty and military officers teaching military officers, and he was instrumental in you two sitting here today, basically saying we should have talented historians and military historians, other types of civilians that come in to augment their expertise at the college if we really want to get after these larger issues that both of you have mentioned that are changing the world. And if you want a deeper education, you're going to have to bring in experts that are not just in the military sphere, but experts in these others, and particularly historians.
So that Spruance comes up with the idea of having the Ernest J. King Professorship of Maritime History, which is my job for 32
I think
years.
you know something about it.
but a whole range of the political science, the Chester W. Niz Chair, and the first to say these naming chairs. But his concept for them at first was really a 1 or 2 year position. They would bring people prominent people from universities here just temporarily. So it wasn't until 1972 that we got a permanent civilian faculty. We had in 1966 we had one permanent civilian until 1972 when Stansfield Turner developed the first.
Well, another side note here too was Admiral Wiley comes back. He eventually writes this book on strategy. He basically says that he felt like the depth of strategic thinking is not overly good. Begins to put together my interest, advanced program in strategy, which I helped direct a small advanced program here at the college on things to think about in a smaller group of students. And he wants to build this into almost like a 3-year program back to a very, very in-depth process of foundational concepts, and then writing, and then a 3rd year publication, and really wants to elevate the study of strategy in particular. I'm not sure that ever gains full acceptance, but it's an interesting side note.
Yeah, sadly it doesn't. But he's very much important in supporting these the new civilian faculty, bringing people in he brings John von Neumann and other famous people, thinking about all the different theories that are involved in how to look at strategy. So he's very important in that. It doesn't get traction with the bureaucracy in Washington, so we eventually do away with that. But he's a very important figure. I got to know him quite well in his later years. So
I think as we take another turn here, you go into the Vietnam War. We have McNamara looking at a lot of defense metrics and management issues, and there seems to be a turn in the reputation of the college and what should be, again, back to the original dialogue, what should be studied and what shouldn't. And we come to the early mid-70s when Admiral Zumwalt is CNO, and he sends Admiral Turner here to make some reforms. And I think we can't escape that time period to chat about how that's influenced the curriculum, but also the reputation of the college at a great deal.
So certainly, the college, as you mentioned, the college had been sort of off on a tangent with the McNamara approach to things. That the curriculum had become very thin. It was more feeling that the students would come here as a rest and play golf, do some sailing, maybe read the paper.
So the Army said, take a knee, drink water, reconnect with your family.
And reconnect with your family, all these sorts of ideas. And I've been an operations officer on a destroyer in town. I was told one day to come over the next morning to report to Admiral Turner, and I was hired on the spot as his research assistant and speechwriter and letter writer. And I had a lot of burning letters and criticisms from that were writing to Turner about how they really disagreed with what he was saying. Commandant of the Army War College in particular said, "What you're bringing in examinations, you're doing all these things."
Grades, examinations. So he was interested in updating students, updating the curriculum, updating the faculty, and doing it at a very rapid pace.
Right. And a very heavy reading load. There were, I think, 1,000 pages, I think, in the first year in the S&P program that I was involved in teaching the first iterations. And but he had very carefully, he'd gotten a group together, and they had decided, looked at and say, well, what should an officer at this level have? What should they focus on? And he created these 3 different departments, which would be taught successively over 3 different trimesters, and have a one on strategy and policy, which was his real jewel in the crown that he devoted most of his time to. And then there was one on operations, where he called it, in those days he called it tactics, and then one on management. And those have all these courses have evolved and refined themselves in the half century since that time. But,
and John, I know that you were the chair of the Strategy and Policy Department, and some of the efforts that he had, so as I recall, he was a Rhodes Scholar, brought back some ideas from Oxford in particular, and the things about case studies, Civ Mill teaching teams, people that he brought in like Philip Crowell and Josiah Bunting and Martin Blumenson, doing different particular pieces, but particularly the Peloponnesian War and studying Thucydides. How did that change both the reputation of the college and how the curriculum looked at the study of strategy in particular?
What's fascinating about the Thucydides being in the curriculum is that I got to talk with a man by the name of William Emerson. He was a World War II veteran, a P-47 pilot in the Mediterranean theater. And when Admiral Turner heard that he was coming to Newport, he reached out to Emerson. Emerson went on, he was a scholar, taught at Yale for many years. He ended his career by being head of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library. And Admiral Turner reached out to Emerson and said, what would make a good strategy curriculum? And Emerson said that he told Admiral Turner that as long as you have 2 major books, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War and Clausewitz's On War, you've got the foundation for a good strategy course. And so they have been staples of the strategy course from the Turner era that John talked about down to our own time. Thucydides, of course, became popular during the Cold War because it was a story about 2 superpowers of their age, of the warring states of ancient Greece, of Sparta against Athens, democratic Athens, the sea power, against the land power, authoritarian, totalitarian regime Sparta. And so you could draw these analogies for the Cold War contest between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it is a very challenging book to read. At the same time, though, the students master it, and it does permit a discussion of some of the most fundamental questions of what is the relationship of strategy to achieving overall national aims, and also of democracy at war. So the book not only has lasted from Thucydides' time to our own, but has lasted in the curriculum of the War College from the Turner time to our own.
And in some ways it sounded like he was also using it as an attempt to talk about very difficult issues like the war in Vietnam, which was a difficult discussion in the classroom.
Yes.
And yet, you know, when I got here, I think in 2005, and I sat at the feet of John Maurer in some ways to learn strategy. You know, I had read Peloponnesian War a little bit, and you know, I was familiar with people like George Marshall, who said that, you know, you can't really understand war and international relations without reading this book. But what I came to understand as I taught with John, taught in the strategy department, was that they were using it as a macro case to underlie so many different elements of strategic thinking. Coalitions, wars of coalitions, war of asymmetrical means, war termination problems, civil relation issues, ideological wars, religious wars, wars of protraction, duration, that all of those refined things that continued on in war after war after war were there for the taking for the student who could be guided through, and it has become a staple. And I think famously, this was considered to be one of the cornerstones of education at Newport. If you came to Newport, you would study Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War.
Right. It's definitely, it was. I was teaching that course at the time, and I'd come from Vietnam, and we all had difficulties in sort of the emotional and very divisive discussions about the Vietnam War. But we could take those ideas and the elements of that and talk about it in terms of the Peloponnesian War. For Turner particularly, I used to stress the Sicilian expedition as one of the main reasons why related to Vietnam. So
interesting.
Which is important because in Sicily, Athens suffers a major defeat. And in the Vietnam War, at the time, looking at the United States, are we a declining power, and is the Soviet Union on the rise? Well, we know the history. It's the Soviet Union that is thrown into the dustbin of history, not the United States. But at the time, the pessimism, will the United States be able to endure in this Cold War rivalry? Or is the United States finished in some way?
And was it a mistake like Sicily to open a secondary theater in a larger war like the Cold War?
Right.
I think that was certainly there. But it's still with us, and I think serves very well as a foundational element of strategic study and education here at the college.
It is a very rich book, and it is useful not only for military officers, but of course Thucydides was the staple for a lot of international relation theorizing. And so the study of Thucydides is important because it gives you a sense of international relations, some of the big themes and concepts there, and trying to apply those big themes and concepts to today as well.
Well, let me just, I know we're running out of time, and in some ways there's so much to think about and cover in 140 years of excellence and influence. But I'll mention some names, what comes to mind when you hear some of these names. Admiral Weschler.
he was a great figure. I got to know him when he was Commander Cruiser Destroyer Force, and I was a lieutenant in the destroyer fleet here. And we became good friends. And he of course been Arleigh Burke's aide and, as a lieutenant early on, and then he was the project officer for the Spruance class ship. Had great insight. Was head of our distance education, then head of our operations department. He was a great influence here. Bernstein.
He was chair of the strategy and policy department in the mid to late 80s. In fact, he hired me in 1988 for the course. And at that time, we had a very robust program of Secretary of the Navy Fellows here as well that came into the college, John, as you talked about, for 1 or 2 years, and then would go back to the academic world. And that was, I think, a very important initiative on the part of John Lehman and should be repeated.
Yes, indeed.
Michael Handel.
Michael Handel was a dear friend of mine. He came into college in 1990.
From the Army War College, I believe.
He came from Carlisle, that's right.
And has written a famous book of Masters of War on Clausewitz Thucydides.
Right, and I first met him back in the mid-1970s when he was finishing his PhD at Harvard with Sam Huntington. And he and I then worked together at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia in the 80s. So it was great to have him come to the college in 1990. And he was a dynamic teacher teacher, very close reader, student of Clausewitz. And so he offered a special elective class that looked at major theorists, but in particular on Clausewitz. And that course was always oversubscribed by the students here, in particular the Army and Marine officers wanted to get into that elective to be with Michael.
Well, when I was growing up as a young Army officer, if one, Maker's Modern Strategy is second edition now, there's 3, was a must-have, and the other one was Michael Handel's Masters of War.
Right.
You just bought that book and you poured through it, and have an opportunity to study with him would have been, educational.
I think it's important to note, too, the impact that the War College curriculum has had on education in general. The National Security Decision-Making course, that has been adapted at business schools. Some of the curriculum has been taken to business schools around the country for those who are in business school who want to understand defense economics. And the Strategy and Policy course has migrated to universities as well. The Yale Grand Strategy course was based on the Strategy and Policy curriculum, because John Lewis Gaddis, the historian
Pulitzer
of the Cold
Prize
War,
biographer of George Kennan. And
he was here for 2 years in the 1970s.
Also famous author of the Cold War, dedicated his Strategies of Containment book to his military teaching partners.
2 military teaching partners.
At Newport.
But these grand strategy courses that have now proliferated and are really sought after by major universities today had its origins here in Newport. So it's the case that we have been the innovators in curriculum. It's not that we're taking curriculum from outside and bringing it here, though we're always aware of what's going on outside in education. But also what we're doing here is pioneering as well. So
John Lewis Gaddis and Paul Kennedy, who I know both of you know well, has famously said that much of what they did in the Yale Grand Strategy course was drawn from some of the strategic literacy and course curriculum here at Newport. And John Lewis Gaddis migrated that to Yale.
Yeah, and you see again Clausewitz, Thucydides in those courses as well.
And Elliot Cohen taught here as well, took some of that same education, I think, to SAIS. And,
Richard Schultz took it up to the Fletcher School. So you have graduate level professional schools of international relations, like the School of Advanced International Studies in Washington and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy have had strategy courses based on what we did here, as well as Yale.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the tremendous influence of the college in the modern era, and still influencing in ripple effects, second and third order effects in the professional education of international security. Didn't get to Stockdale, but an important figure nonetheless as he came back. I'm certain you knew him.
I knew him very well. Famously, he was the one who took the call from Admiral Rickover. I remember he told me personally about this, and he was going over to Spruance Hall to introduce an evening lecture. The telephone rings, and it's 4-star Admiral Rickover telling him to close down the college. What a useless place this is. And,
but Stockdale, famous as a POW. Said that he had, as he bailed out of his plane, that he had fallen back into the ancient Greeks, thinking not in the modern world. But when he came here, he famously built an ethics course as well, Foundations of Moral Obligation,
that he taught himself.
That he taught and is still being used around the world on ethical and moral thinking from some of the classics in Greek thinking and ethics. And
but we were also a pioneer in accrediting colleges of this kind. We were the first college to do that, and against a lot of criticism that people didn't think it was appropriate to military college should have an academic accreditation. But we had Admiral Kurth was the president of the college, who had a PhD from Harvard, as well as being a flag officer, and was able to very effectively put our case.
I remember well when I first arrived at the college, John, in the summer of 1988, he called the faculty over to Pringle Auditorium and said that he was going to embark on this. And so hats off to Admiral Kurth for starting that. And now I think all the war colleges have become accredited as well. Right. Yes.
Well, as we close out this session, we'll go around and last thoughts about the legacy and the significance of the college. The college has been here for 140 years. John Maurer, Dr. Maurer, we'll start with you, and we'll go to Dr. Hattendorf.
Well, the legacy of the college is an important one in advancing professional education. And we see it today. The college remains innovative in much that it does on educating future leaders, but also on the research side of what we do, wargaming. So the education mission is one that is an important one and remains important down to this day. And when you look at the college courses that we have, it's not just the 3 core courses, but also a very rich elective program as well that we have here that the students benefit from. The students enjoy very much the electives that are offered here, and the number of electives that we have is really pretty astounding, that the choices that they have. I have taught courses on arms control. I've taught a course on Winston Churchill, but there are courses on technology and warfare that are offered, a Vietnam War elective that is a very popular elective, history courses on the Second World War as well as leadership and ethics. So there's a very rich course offering here at the War College for students. And I think it remains true to the founding fathers of the institution of Luce and Mahan that we're offering a first-class education here for the officers who attend.
It's not only a domestic issue, it's an international influence that we have. We had our first foreign students here in 1892 with some Swedish officers who, one of those officers went and after his year here, founded a similar institution for the Royal Swedish Navy.
Well, that's an important point. I mean, we didn't mention international officers, but they are an extraordinarily influential group in naval circles around the world. Many of them have gone back to be CNOs. Some of them have gone back to be defense secretaries or head of defense.
Even have a king and 2 presidents of countries.
I remember I was eating lunch. I was in a Middle East country and with a graduate of the college from 30 years ago, and he said that in that grouping, he came here as an international student, and there was 33 of them in that group, and I want to say 28 of them became chief of navies, which is an unbelievable amount of influence globally.
We have, all sorts of, we have people who have become major ambassadors. We have, I've just done, in my new addition to the history, there's an appendix on distinguished graduates from the beginning. So it's really amazing to see the number of people who have become Chief of Navy not only in the United States, perhaps fewer in the United States, but in other countries. And then many have become Chief of Defense Staff. As I mentioned, we've had some prime ministers and presidents, and the King of Tonga, who had been a naval officer before he came here, before he knew he was going to be king. And a huge range of people that have worldwide defense. So when, from the time of Admiral Colbert and the development of the Naval Command College, you have this international course that comes and brings in enormous international connections. So when you talk to the alumni today, or when, for example, when the International Sea Power Symposium meets, and the world's chiefs of Navy meet here roughly every 2 years, and a fair proportion of those people attending are graduates of the world's navies and graduate of the college and are chiefs of the world's navies.
Well, a couple of closing remarks. One is that something that John Maurer said a minute ago, and it goes back to Turner. Sometimes Turner reforms have been called a revolution, but in your book you say it's not really a revolution, but it was a return to the founding principles of what it is that the college should be about in excellence and in study. And I think a return as well to Luce. Luce originally said that you're here to promote your own education. And I think the Turner reforms as well, you're going to get out of this as much as you put into it, and you're responsible for some of your own education. I'm so glad that you are doing a reissue of Sailors and Scholars. I think it deserves a reissue with some pictures and modern look to it. It's a tremendous read about what is, I've always considered it a privilege to work here at the college. And it is a crown jewel. It's a national treasure. And it's and this book, and I think you're doing a volume 2 to update it in the modern age, has been a tremendous influence in so many ways over these 140 years. And I wrote this down. I don't think I could do better than to follow John Hattendorf's lead in the closing pages of Sailors and Scholars. He quotes our founder, Admiral Stephen Luce, that at the opening of any war, any so-called inspiration of genius may be trusted only when it is the result of long and careful study and reflection. And the purpose of the college and its legacy remains today, again quoting Admiral Luce, to broaden an officer's views, extend his mental horizon on national and international questions, and give him a just appreciation of the great variety and the extent of the requirements of his, and I would add, or her profession. Dr. Maurer and Dr. Hattendorf, what a tremendous discussion on the significance of the U.S. Naval War College. Truly appreciate both of you providing your insights and joining us on this special edition of the Trident, Viribus Mera Victoria, the U.S. Naval War College, 140 years of excellence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Trident, a podcast on irregular warfare. Opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, or the U.S. Naval War College. Please find us at www.usnwc.edu/CIWAG, and consider subscribing to our bi-weekly newsletter, The Patrol, or listen to further episodes of The Trident. Until next time.